our series that we're going to go through over the next few weeks, it was created because someone had a question during another series, during another discussion. They had a question that came up. They texted in, and I thought, you know what? That's a great question. You know what? That matters. It didn't relate to the series we were in, so I just texted back, hey, listen, we're going to create a series on that, and we're going to have that discussion. And then in the middle of creating that series and preparing for this series that we're going to do, someone else had the same question and gave us some feedback. Said, hey, this is something I'm just wondering about. And the question really came down to the idea of how do you know that like you're hearing from God? How do you know that like the direction that you want to go, or the thing that you're feeling or thinking, and the things that are happening in your life, how do you know if that's from God or not? And really the core of it is how do you know that you're hearing from God? And how do you hear God? How do you put yourself in a position and an alignment so that you can hear what God is trying to say to you? And I know at this discussion we have people kind of all over the spectrum of belief and worldview, and some people would say, I don't necessarily believe in a God, or maybe you believe in a God, but it's not necessarily a personal God that is speaking that you can hear from. And there's other people who are like, I just don't know if there's a God or not. And so there's other people who would say, I don't believe there is a God. And so I think that this really hits whether you're skeptical of even the fact of a God, or whether you already believe that you understand how to hear from God. I think this is going to make for a wonderful, deeply spiritual discussion. And I think that it matters. And I think that when we do these series and we have these discussions, especially one like this, it can help us all evaluate our spiritual lives and how in tune we are to hearing God and putting ourselves in position to hear what God might say. And so today, I feel like we have to start this whole conversation talking about Marduk, the ancient Babylonian god, right? Like maybe that's a weird place to start, but I think we got to start there. You see, the Babylonians, they were a major ancient civilization, right? They were key to so many other civilizations that we know throughout history. And in the mid-1800s, some archaeologists were looking through some of the Babylonian kingdom ruins, and they came across this thing called, I want to make sure I say it correctly, the Enuma Elish. And basically it was these tablets. It was like 1,000 lines of storytelling. And what it was the story of was the gods that the Babylonians worshipped. And the god that was highlighted, kind of like the number one god in their pantheon of gods, was Marduk. And Marduk kind of got there because there was like this family of gods, and they were fighting all the time. Right? And they were always angry at each other, and they were always vying for position of who's like the number one god in this pantheon of gods. And Marduk kind of like solidified his place in that by like killing and destroying and waging war on the other gods. And specifically, Tiamat, the goddess of water, was said to have created dragons to come up out of the water and to fight against Marduk, and Marduk destroyed them, and then took Tiamat and actually ripped her in half, and that's how the earth and the world began to be created, and the waters above and the waters below, right? So the waters that were in the sky and the waters that were on the earth, and violently rips her in half and creates this and establishes Marduk as the god in the pantheon of gods. And then we see that when he does this, then he begins to create. We see the sun, moon, and stars created, and we see the plants and animals created, and then man, kind of almost as an afterthought, gets created. And every year the Babylonians would celebrate. They'd have a major celebration of Marduk as the god of gods, the god who creates. This was a creation out of violence and chaos and anger. And at one point, the Hebrew people were actually exiled to Babylon, right? They were uprooted out of their kingdom, out of their home, and they were sent to Babylon, and they had their stories of God and how they understood God, and how they understood the God of creation, but they were placed in this new kingdom, and they were assimilated to this new kingdom. So imagine you're coming out of exile, and you want to tell the next generation about your God because they've been hearing all about the God of the Babylonians, Marduk. And this very impersonal, violent, angry God who created them. And so we see that the account of Genesis, and specifically the creation account, was taken from different sources and then kind of compiled and edited even and placed together and compiled after the Babylonian exile. So they had these things, these different sources, both oral tradition and some written tradition, and so we see them gather them and compile them and compose them into what we know as Genesis and even the Torah or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of our Bible that we have in the back there for anyone who wants to take one and use one, read it. And so they're coming out of this, and basically what happens is we see when they found this Enuma Elish, that there were some striking similarities to the Genesis account. Because they had the Genesis account, that had been preserved, and they were like, wow, this Babylonian account of creation and the Genesis account of creation are strikingly similar. Right? The idea of the waters above and the waters below. We find that in Genesis. The idea of creating the sun, moon, and stars, and then creating the plants and the animals and the fish, and kind of this progress of creation, and the creation eventually of man. And there was this striking resemblance. And so Genesis would never be read again the same, right? After they have this new archaeological discovery. But even more powerful, more astounding than the similarities in the stories, because you would imagine that ancient civilizations would have similar understandings of beginnings or creation or how they understood and how they viewed God. We actually find that the differences are more important. Because really, if you're composing this, and there's just this your idea of God, and there's this God over here in this other civilization, and you want to pass on to the next generation your stories, you're going to give a different picture of this God. Because the question really becomes, what is God like, and who are we as the people of this God? In Genesis, and specifically the creation story, is not a scientific or historical documentation for us to follow. It's a theological statement. It's an idea of this is who God is and who we are as people of God. And the interesting thing about the creation story is not just how similar it is to the story of another ancient civilization, but how different it is. But ultimately, it leads us to this thought as we kind of begin this, is that hearing what God says begins with the belief that God is saying something. And when we look at the creation stories, here's what we find in Genesis. God speaks things into creation. That he speaks things into existence. So while Marduk, through these violent confrontations and this anger and this chaos, creates the world and even man as an afterthought, we find that God, the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the God that we find in Genesis, creates through speaking. So instead of violence, the spoken word. And we find that from chaos comes order. And that there's the extreme creativity to this order. And that man is not just an afterthought, but is an elevated thought. That we're going to create everything, and then there's this idea that God was in community. We call it this dynamic communal energy, says to itself that we should create man in our own image to be like us. And so we find that human beings aren't an afterthought. They're not a throwaway. They're not just servants of the gods, but they have the image of the divine in them. And that every person, no matter what they've done, what they've said, how they've behaved, where they come from, every person is created in the image of God. And this divine creator of beauty and order and design puts his own divinity into these human beings and says we're going to create them in our image on purpose, with purpose, creatively and beautifully. So that when the next generation says, who is God? What is God like? And how does that affect how we are? And who are we as people of God? They can say, listen, like we have value. It's not ascribed value, it's intrinsic value because of the very nature of this God. And they would have seen the similarities to the other ancient gods of that time, but they also would have seen the difference, the striking difference. And creation speaks of a speaking God. God speaks through creation and to human beings. We see that when human beings come onto the page, that there's actually this very personal relationship that happens in Genesis, where God actually, having Adam, we see in Genesis 2, he has this relationship with Adam, and then he kind of gives Adam these responsibilities to be a partner in the creation of the earth. And that he sees that Adam, that there isn't this in-kindness for Adam, and then we see woman is created. And it speaks to the value, and think about this in ancient civilizations, that this God speaks value into men and women equally. That was huge. That didn't exist in ancient civilizations. It doesn't exist in our modern world all the time. And that these two people have value and importance. And so you hear this story, and again, it's not about a history or a scientific of origin. It's about a theological statement of who God is and who we are as the people of God. And what's interesting even more is the Babylonians would have had Marduk, right? This name for their God. And the Hebrews, they had a name for their God. It was Yahweh. It was Yahweh. And so you would imagine that this story would like pit, Marduk. It would be like Marduk versus Yahweh, right? Make sure I spell that right. But actually what we find in Genesis 1, when speaking of God creating, is we find this different Hebrew word, Elohim, which is the word for just God, source, the thing. Not our God, not our banner, right? Not our representation, because people, especially in ancient cultures, their view of their God is how they would view themselves. So if my God is violence and warring, then I am violence and warring, and that's okay, right? And we know that the Babylonians, the Assyrians, were some of the most violent people throughout ancient history. But this Yahweh over here, again, is this very different thing. But what we see in the creation stories in chapter 2, we see Yahweh show up. We see them name God as their God. But at the very crux of it, when we see in Genesis 1, we see the name Elohim, which is just the in general God. Not our God, not your God, just God that spans everybody and everything. And that creation, the very creative act of God, speaks to the character and nature of God, and creation speaks of a speaking God who speaks to humans and through creation. But then we find this. This is just fascinating. I think if you look at that account, you look at that story, you look at the character and nature of God, we fast forward to Jesus, and there's this guy by the name of John who was the youngest of all Jesus's like 12 disciples, the apostles, and we know there were many more disciples, but there were like 12 that were kind of the leaders, and then we see 3 that were especially close to Jesus, and John was one of those 3. He even is often called the disciple who Jesus loved, although we only find that in the account that he wrote, so maybe that's just how he felt, right? He felt very special to Jesus. But we know he was the youngest, and we know that even the care of Jesus' mother was given to John as Jesus was dying, which is very, very important. And so John, he writes in his gospel, or the word gospel, there's just the good news. So in his good news account of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus and the work of Jesus and the person of Jesus, he starts the whole thing off with kind of like this little poem. It's kind of in your Bible, a lot of times it'll be marked as like the prologue to the whole thing. It's kind of like this separate thing to the rest of everything else that's kind of hooked on this little introduction that he gives about Jesus. And I think it's fascinating what he says, because he's going to parallel this Genesis account of who God is and how to understand and how to view God. And here's what happens. He says this: in the beginning was the Word. Now, why is he referring to Jesus as the Word? The word in the Greek there is logos. And why is he referring to it as the Word? Well, it's simply this. Words are the medium through which we express, like our thoughts, plans, actions, feelings, intentions. It's how we communicate. God created through speaking. God communicates through speaking, and who speaks of God and who is God speaking but a person, and that person is Jesus. Look what it says here. In the beginning was the Word already existed. Okay, so this is interesting because he's making this statement about Jesus. Jesus didn't become enlightened. Jesus didn't become a God. Jesus didn't become divinity. Jesus was and is and will forever be the very essence of divinity. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Literally, the Word was face to face with God. If you look in the literal Greek, I spent an entire, these two sentences here, I spent an entire 3 days in Bible college on that because it holds so much. And in the literal Greek, what it's saying there is that this word, Jesus, was face to face with God and was of the exact essence of divinity of God. Look what it continues to say. If we see this in the beginning language, like in Genesis. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. How did God create, right? Genesis tells us that God spoke and this thing happened. God spoke and this thing happened. What was God speaking? Well, God was speaking. It was Jesus. He was the Word. He was the expression. He was the creative element through which God spoke the world into existence. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and life brought light to everyone. So we have this Word that is creative, and it gives life to everything that was created, which is very interesting because if we think about this, we are connected to this earth. You see that there are some forms of belief that everything is only spiritual, right? And that this isn't reality, only what spiritual is reality. And then there's things that it's like, no, only what is matter, only what is material, only what is biological, that is the only thing that is real. And what we see here is that life from the Spirit of God, the Word of God, is both spirit and matter together, and that everything, we are all connected to each other and to everything. That's deep. That's something else. That's an entirely different kind of God that connects us all and to everything. And life and light was brought to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. It can never overcome it. You understand this when you're in a room and you light a match. That match doesn't get swallowed up by the darkness. If anything, that light pierces the darkness. And so Jesus doesn't just bring life to everything, connect life to everything. It's the idea of light, and that has to do with truth, the revealing of things. Like last night when I walked into my dark house and I kicked a toy across the room really loudly and thought I woke the whole house up, right? Because I couldn't see what was true in front of me. And he says when it comes to life, Jesus is that light. Interesting fact. In the Genesis story, light was created before the sun and the moon. How did that happen? Jesus, the spoken word of God, was the light that lit up everything. That was the light. So we see that Jesus didn't become God, he was God. And he is the very expression of God. So think about this. Jesus speaks of a speaking God. We talk about around here, we want to follow Jesus into a new life, right? We want to follow Jesus and we want to help other people do the same. Why? Because Jesus speaks of a speaking God. It really boils down to this. If we want to hear God, we listen to the created and the creator. God is speaking through his creation. That's each other, by the way, right? And the things around us. I got to hike out in Red Rock yesterday. I stood in awe of some things that I don't understand. Felt very small. Because usually when I'm in a room, I feel kind of big. But out there, I felt very small. And God speaks through the created and the creator, through Jesus himself. And it brings us to our idea worth discussing today, is a personal God speaks personally and in person. A personal God speaks personally and in person through the person of Jesus. Personally, because I believe that this God isn't this far away, distant thing, but that God is close and near to all of us because we bear his image. And that his Spirit is here and in our presence and is ever present. And that God is speaking. One of my favorite authors from the early 19th century, A.W. Tozer, wrote a book, The Pursuit of God. He has an entire chapter on the speaking voice of God. You can actually download that book in like an e-reader or PDF version or whatever for free online. Just look up The Pursuit of God, and I read it every year because it is insanely spiritual in a way that I need every year to put some things into perspective. And he has an entire chapter on the speaking voice of God. He says this, I love it. God is speaking, not God spoke. He's specifically writing this because a lot of people put so much authority in the Bible, they forget that God didn't speak in the Bible and then close it, but that God has always been speaking and is still speaking today if we're listening. Not God spoke, but God is speaking. He is by his nature continuously articulate. And we find that in Genesis. Remember, they're talking about who is God? What is God like? And who are we as his people? Well, he's a God who's speaking to us. He's continuously articulate. He fills the world with his speaking voice. Again, in his creation. You look around the world and you can say it's just matter, it's just material, it's just things, and here and then it's gone, or it doesn't matter. I would say, no. In all of it, in every person and in everything that we see, we can look and we go, how is God speaking to me? Why? Because a personal God speaks personally and in person. The Hebrew people believed that God was personal. He was not distant. He was not far away. He was personal. And they see that through creation and then lived out in the Word of God, who was Jesus. The expression of God's thoughts, plans, actions, intentions, and feelings towards mankind are found in Jesus. So, from God to Jesus to us, God is speaking. Do you hear it? In the next few weeks, our discussion is going to be on how do we position ourselves, how do we discern, how do we understand what this speaking God is saying. And I hope that today, maybe if you even came in skeptical or not sure or whatever, that this discussion moves your heart, right? Moves the dial of your heart just a little bit towards believing that God is saying something so that you can begin to hear what God has to say.